How's it going, guys? My name is Stone, and welcome to these reviews. Today, I'm not going to be reviewing anything in particular, but I had a cool idea for a video I thought I'd share with y'all. I'm going to be talking about 11, not 10, but 11 albums that blew my socks off. That was me signifying how much they blew me away because I threw a pair of socks just now. These are albums that blew me away when I first discovered them, whether that be the first time I ever heard of them or gradually with multiple listens. I tried my best to keep these albums in chronological order in terms of what albums I heard first and how they influenced my music tastes over time and into the next artist. These are albums that gave me a new appreciation for a genre or subgenre I was unfamiliar with at the time, and four of these albums, I think it's 4 of the 11, I've already reviewed on my channel, so I definitely will try not to go track for track with all these. This might be a little bit of a ramble, but I'd say it's an entertaining ramble for myself. And yeah, just talk about how much these albums have left a huge impression on me and kind of give you guys an idea of how this artist got me into this artist and so on and so forth, you know? You feel? Yeah. And just so you know, I actually got some Love Supreme going on right now, you know, because John Coltrane, you know. Definitely we'll get to him on my channel. But I'll start it off from the very beginning. So to give a little background, one of the first few times I started smoking weed, I was listening to a lot of stoner metal, which is a great genre. I don't go back to it too often anymore, but I still enjoy it. But then my girlfriend at the time introduced me to a song called Comfortably Numb when I was like baked out of my mind, right? And the way I really felt like Jesse in that one scene in Breaking Bad where I was in the bed just floating, hearing Roger Waters say, "Hello, is there anybody in there?" It really felt like, you know, it was talking to me. It felt like a real psychedelic scene in like a movie. So the next morning, I decided to look through the Pink Floyd discography, and I feel like a lot of their albums, even if they're not considered great, I feel like their album covers say otherwise. Examples I could think of were Ummagumma and Final Cut. I like those albums, but they're definitely not the cream of the crop. Anywho, I was kind of just looking through Pink Floyd discography based off their album covers, and the first album I listened to by them definitely blew me away. I've already talked about it, but Atom Heart Mother, just a crazy album. I remember just clicking on the title track, seeing what's up, and I remember being, I guess, intimidated by the fact that it's like a 23-minute epic. That's something I was very unfamiliar with at that time. But every second that was moving in the song when I was driving to work was just otherworldly. I was sober at this point, but it was still blowing my mind. As I say, blow my socks off, you know? And this album really did a lot for me in terms of like, okay, I gotta get more into whatever kind of music this is, whether it's psychedelic, experimental, progressive. I didn't know all those terms then, but I would soon learn those terms thanks to, you know, Atom Heart Mother starting it all for me. And even besides the title track, I feel like this is before I even got into vinyl. Listening to the tracks that follow Atom Heart Mother really kind of took me aback in the sense of how, you know, these tracks kind of like flow together in a strange way, and then closing on Alan's Psychedelic Breakfast, which is a bit of a head scratcher, but I still really enjoy that track. And again, I feel like it was a great introduction to all the music I'd start listening to from this point forward. So yeah, and then I did really get into psychedelic rock at this point because I was like, I just called that psych rock because, you know, Pink Floyd, they're psychedelic rock, Dark Side of the Moon, all that jazz. And then I started looking up lists of like greatest psychedelic albums of all time. That's kind of my starting point. And I remember seeing this come up a few times, and I remember finding psychedelic albums that I liked but didn't really blow me away like Atom Heart Mother. And the second time I really was blown away with 60s psych rock, or I guess that was 70, I think. This is 60s, but Grateful Dead's second album, Anthem of the Sun, is just a wild studio effort by the band. It's complete, I mean, it's live stuff kind of like thrown together in a way to just sound, like, again, otherworldly. It just really blew me away with how trippy this is. There's a lot of melody though. I love like New Potato Caboose. That's It for the Other One, of course, is a banger. And even Alligator into Caution Do Not Stop on the tracks is just fantastic. I feel like if I had heard this later on in my life, in my psychedelic journey, I wouldn't have cared for it as much, but I think since it was like one of those big eye openers to like what you could do with like, yeah, like just these like loose psychedelic jams. I mean, this is like the first real live stuff I heard by the Grateful Dead. Then I heard stuff like Live Dead and even Europe 72, which I wouldn't say that's too psychedelic, but songs like Prelude, Feedback off Live Dead. So I'm kind of pointing at the where my records are. Anywho, this album was a great start. It's still probably my favorite Grateful Dead studio album. But it just does a great job at being super fucking free world. I don't know, I'm trying to think of the terms, like just out of sorts, but not sounding too pretentious. At least to my ears, you know. Fine introduction, fine album to listen to while you're tripping, in my humble opinion. Then, getting into Pink Floyd, I remember seeing King Crimson's debut album cover everywhere I went, the Court of the Crimson King. And while I did hear the album first and really enjoy it, it wasn't until I heard this album by the band, Lark's Tongues and Aspect, that I really had a huge appreciation for this band, for just the way they go about writing these songs with these crazy progressions. I'm really referring to the title track on this one, the part 1. But even the rest of the songs, I love Easy Money, the way they kind of like jam off each other, and the use of percussion on here is fantastic. This is probably one of the first albums that really made me appreciate not two drummers necessarily, but you know, drummer Bill Bruford and Jamie Muir, is that his name? Yeah, Jamie Muir on percussion. And just the crazy sounds he gets off it, like kind of like playing against the music in a way. It's just amazing, and the way they kind of like change the emotion of like the title track part 1 is just something else. It really made me appreciate, you know, I mean, I was already getting into instrumental music by this point, but King Crimson were the band that really made me realize just how much you could do without vocals in terms of just providing emotion with a violin, the crazy jazz, metal-ish rock, which obviously this was a groundbreaking album at the time, really influenced a lot of post-rock, experimental metal. I don't know, I can't list all the genres, but you know what I mean. This album is otherworldly. I'll probably say it too many times in this review, but great album. My favorite King Crimson album. Second would probably be the debut, and then third would be Lizard. But after that, after King Crimson, I remember hearing, oh, you gotta check out Genesis, and I was like, okay. And then the first song I listened to by Genesis was Invisible Touch, and I was like, isn't this the song I'd hear at the grocery stores and all that? So that kind of paused my efforts for Genesis. It wasn't until I heard Selling England by the Pound that I was like, okay, I could see what's cool about this band. Definitely different from the 80s stuff, but it wasn't until someone introduced me to this album, what I'd still consider to be my favorite album of all time, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Now, at this point, I had been pretty familiar with concept albums. Obviously, I had listened to all the Pink Floyd stuff before getting into Genesis, but the way they go about this concept with the lyrics and the band, and though the band recorded their stuff separately and then Peter Gabriel did his lyrics separately, they just go hand in hand, and it really feels like a twisted movie that it's hard to find I mean, it's definitely a blur when it comes to the storyline and all that, but I feel like it's how you interpret the music that makes it that much more profound. And this album has such a huge effect on my interest in progressive rock. Though, like I said, I've been listening to King Crimson. This really got me into more progressive rock and just the storytelling, and I just love this album. I think that's why it really blew me away. It's not like it didn't really introduce me that much more than like King Crimson did, but like it's just so good, and it really blew me away. I remember listening to the whole thing on a drive up to Eureka, and I remember I listened to the title track, which is one of my favorite songs by Genesis, and I was like wanting to hear more, but I was like, I'm gonna wait till I'm on the road driving, like, you know, several hours, you know, so I have plenty of time to hear this thing. And I'm glad I waited, because I listened to the whole thing all at once, and it just tore me apart and built me back up again. One of the coolest records out there. And again, this is another record I'd say is like in my top 10, top 20. Don't really I'm not really that strict on like, ooh, my favorite albums of all time, because like The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, I've heard it so many times, I don't need to listen to it that often because I know I love it. And same kind of goes with this record. Third by Soft Machine. I mean, this is the album that really got me into jazz, or got me familiar with, like, you know, instruments such as like clarinet, saxophone. Trying to see what else is there. Yeah, saxophone, violin, trombone. Even though it was very much like a rock, jazz, fusion kind of thing, the drumming is just incredible. All about, like, just the way they go about these songs is just so effortless. It's just pretty magical, you know? I mean, even though this album does feel like a compilation of 4 songs, all of these songs stand out on their own. So it kind of works in a way, especially with it being 1 song per side. And again, I remember seeing this album just in record stores or just seeing it online, the cover. So that was kind of the reason I got into it. But yeah, I feel like this was a great starting point for like jazz, rock, jazz fusion. Just the idea of jazz, because at this point, I had listened to Genesis, King Crimson, and all that. And though they have more of a classical influence for sure, I was still intimidated to listen to jazz because it's like, where do you start? You know, there's so many artists, there's so many kinds of jazz. It didn't seem like rock music, you know, there's like classic rock. There's not really classic jazz. Maybe there is, maybe I don't know, but either way, a masterpiece. Like I said, check out my review on it. Though I feel like I'm pretty stiff in that review, you guys gotta know that I love the album. It's freaking amazing. Now, another album that really blew me away when it blew me away when I first discovered it, but I gained a bigger love for it with listening to the entirety. But I remember seeing this album a lot on like music review places and all that, and this is the first krautrock album I've ever heard, and it really blew me away, particularly the tracks. I'm gonna probably missay this one. The third song, or sorry, the 5th song on the album, AUMGM, and then Pecking O. I remember listening to those songs, not only being kind of freaked out by them because they're just very scary music and ominous sounding, but just like, I remember thinking, is this even music? This sounds like art in a way. Not to say that art isn't music or music isn't art, but like, I guess at this point I was so used to just music being kind of like melodic, or, you know, kind of have moments. I mean, I don't know. I feel like this album really goes off like grooves and atmosphere, especially with a track like Hallelujah, which is one of my favorite Can songs, and even the shorter songs like Paper House, Bring Me Coffee and Tea. They're really catchy and all that, but I feel like the way this album is just put together is just outstanding, especially like I said, with how Pecking O is just crazy sounding music that really blew me away. If I had an extra pair of socks, I'd throw them again, because I remember hearing it really early on, like after Pink Floyd, but not coming back to it for a while, just because I was kind of, you know, kind of spooked. I was like, what do the rest of those songs sound like? But the rest of those songs are a little more tame. But either way, this was a fine introduction to krautrock, and I'm glad I finally got that on vinyl. And then coming up, I have another album I've talked about on this channel. I haven't reviewed it yet, because who am I to review this album, you know? But it is probably this is also jazz fusion, but definitely one of the first jazz artists that got me into jazz, and that is Miles Davis and his, I couldn't tell you the number of this album, but you know, Bitches Brew, 1970. Just a wild album. I feel like the way Miles and the rest of the band play it off of each other, it's like it complements them, but also like goes against the grain in a way that you would think sounds off-putting, but it's just really, again, like otherworldly. Nothing like anything else. Nothing like, I'm trying to think of the way I'm stuttering here. It's a very unique album, very unique listen. There's just so many amazing moments on this album. I mean, Spanish Key, the way they build up that song. Sanctuary is probably my favorite on here, even if it's a little easier to digest. I feel like this album in general is like, I've listened to this album like baked out of my mind on hikes, and I feel like things just make sense when I listen to this record. It's just so good. This is an original 2i pressing I have. It's a little beat up, as you can tell, but it sounds fantastic, and I love this album, you know. You can't go wrong with Bitches Brew. There's more albums by Miles Davis that, I don't know, I feel like my favorite Miles Davis album right now is Get Up With It, which is a great album. I fell in love with the album, but there's a difference between falling in love and being taken aback, like this record did to me. And at this point too, I remember a lot of people recommending some Frank Zappa to me since I was into like getting into jazz, was into King Crimson and Pink Floyd, and I remember hearing Apostrophe really liking it, but didn't really like blow me away, you know, not like my socks. But it wasn't until I heard Freaka that I was getting like I was understanding where these people were coming from. And though I almost put Freaka on this list, it was really this album that took me aback. Uncle Me, I've talked about it before. I'm gonna get around to reviewing it. Probably do a songs rank thing since it's a double album. But it's just crazy album. I remember just listening to the first 3 tracks hiking and just going like, WTF, what is going on? With the first song, I should know what it is. Yeah, Uncle Me, the title theme, followed by the voice of Cheese, which that really threw me off. I was like, is this something I'm gonna like? Eventually I did come around to loving it, but then yeah, like 9 Types of Industrial Pollution, that's just some crazy music. And well, I'll open it back up, more songs like Project X, Wild Song, and even like the comedic songs like Dog Breath and The Year of the Plague, the Uncle Meat variations, Electric Aunt Jemima. It's just wild music, you know. It definitely made me question how far I want to take my experimental music taste, you know. But it did grow on me over a few listens. It took me aback, but then I fell in love with it. And one song that I really fell in love with as soon as I heard it was King Kong, which of course that's probably one of the most popular songs on this album. And I could see why. It's definitely more of a jam number. It's considered to be one of the first jazz fusion songs, as well as like Bitches Brew and whatnot, so that's kind of cool. And yeah, it's just a fine introduction to Zappa's work and really made me appreciate him being a composer, because I feel like all these artists, I mean, Miles Davis is very much a composer, Soft Machine, Mike Ratledge, Ellen Dean, yeah, they're all very much composers, but I feel like hearing this wacky music made me realize you can't just like, I imagine it's easier to read this music on paper rather than just trying to memorize it, because this stuff is wild. And of course, you know, getting into Zappa, you know where that leads people. It leads you into some crazy territory, some territory that I can never go back from. One of my favorite artists, you guys already know, Captain Beefheart. I mean, this guy has been probably the artist I listen to the most. He was my top artist this year, so that goes to show you just how wild I could be. Sorry, the record's done. Gotta turn that off real quick. But yeah, fucking Trout Mask Replica. Oh, this album, when I first heard it, I remember seeing a lot of videos like, ooh, worst album of all time, you know? But also hearing it as like one of the best albums of all time. And I gave like Frownland a listen, and I was like, okay, I can see why people like are scared of this or not interested. But it wasn't until I heard Ella Guru somewhere that I was like, okay, there's some catchy moments on this thing. Let me give it another listen. And while I was hiking, again, most of these albums I listen to on hikes that really, being around nature, hearing new music, in the right setting, it can really take you away, you know? And this album took me places for sure. I remember it was giving me a headache and a half, which I feel like with some albums that are this experimental, much like a Jandek record or something, it's like, yeah, they really have to plow through it in order to, I don't know, get a better understanding or a fuller appreciation. I feel like with this record, I listened to it all the way. It didn't really stick with me at first, but kind of like that one video of the guy who made The Simpsons, he kind of talks about this record and how, you know, it takes multiple listens to really get it. And once you give it multiple listens, you tend to fall in love with it. And honestly, I agree with that 100%. I love this album now. Definitely in my top 10 albums for sure, alongside Third and Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. This just gave me a huge appreciation for like polytones and polyrhythms and all that. Not to sound like some music theory dude, because clearly I'm struggling talking about how awesome these albums are. But either way, this took me aback, man. It's just crazy music. Not only is the music, like, the drumming is amazing, the guitar work's amazing, the bass works great too. It's hard to hear the bass, but even just Beefheart himself with his approach to just kind of like playing these, I mean, he doesn't play much of the horn work on here. I think it's his cousin. But either way, just these crazy sounding horns, crazy ass lyrics that I've grown to love too, just gave me a huge appreciation for music and just how much you could do with music. And following that, we got another band that, again, definitely was a headache and a half trying to get into, but they really paid off. this is the only album I have by them, but this is the first album I heard by them. The Residents. Meet the Residents. Crazy album. I feel like comparing it to the rest of the stuff, it's not even that bad. I think it's just, like I said, it's got a real creepy tone to it, but the way they go about making these songs is very interesting, because from what I understand, they weren't playing this stuff live at the time, so they were just worried about learning it enough to play it, record it, and then move on to something else, which I find that to be awesome for a guy like me who was in a band for some time, where we would just practice like 10 songs constantly so we could play them tight and perform them live. They didn't have to worry about this or that. They just had to worry about getting it on the reels and the tapes. And just the way, like, these melodies are pretty catchy, especially something like Smelly Tongues, Guy Lombardot, Number One, or Num E Run, however you want to pronounce it. They got a lot of good melodies to them. It's just the instruments they use and like the way the song transitions into another moment. It's just crazy. You can really see that on the second side with songs like Season's Greetings and Energy, especially Energy. It's just like great first date music. That's what I call it, you know? But yeah, this album definitely took me aback. I'd say another album by them that really struck me was Unavailable, which I don't have that yet on vinyl. But it's, again, because how often do I listen to that record? It's like it takes me away, but it's like, I don't know. Maybe I just have to give it a few more listens. Next thing you know, I'll be reviewing it. But yeah, I'll definitely get around to reviewing this album before I do Unavailable. And then finally, we get to an easier album to listen to, a jazz album. Now I'm really into jazz, especially like Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Bill Evans, and then this guy right here, Pharoah Sanders. Now this album is incredible. I remember seeing this on Rate Your Music. That's kind of what I use a lot nowadays to find new albums and discover artists. And I remember seeing this at like top 5 of 1969, and that's one of my favorite years of music. I'm like, okay, what's this guy all about? Spiritual jazz. That's one of the descriptions I saw. I was like, okay. I remember seeing all these comments or reviews talking about how, like, oh, it's like one of the craziest albums you'll hear. It's so spiritual and all that. And I had my doubts. I was already gaining a bias from those comments. But man, when I put on the 30-minute, I wouldn't say title track, but you know, the creator has a master plan, it immediately took me by storm. I was like, oh my god, this is the new thing I gotta listen to. This is definitely, out of all these albums, this is the most recent album to take me away. As I said, I've been trying to go in order with this stuff, but this stuff really blew me away, especially like, I mean, when I first heard the song, I remember thinking it was maybe just a little longer than it should be, but for 30 minutes, it is incredible. It does take you places. It takes you to heaven and back. And even this track that follows it, Colors, I remember ending The Creator Must Have a Master Plan, thinking, no way Colors is gonna like even be half as good as the song. But honestly, for it being only 5 minutes, it does a great job at simplifying what the creator's song basically is, you know? Just very magical music, otherworldly, heavenly. It's just such good stuff. Then another album I should have pulled out now, I'll just tell you guys real quick, is the Shag's Philosophy of the World. That album really took me aback in terms of how, I guess it was just crazy-ass music. To simplify my words, you know. People that didn't know how to play music, playing music, and it actually sounding pretty good. So I'll give them that. So there you go, 11, not 10, 11 albums that blew my socks off. I'd love to know what your guys' thoughts are on these albums. I'd love to know albums you recommend that you think will blow my socks off, because that's all I'm trying to do, is just lose more socks here and there, everywhere. And yeah, I'll be on the lookout for that krautrock video. I promise it'll be coming up soon. But I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.